Hey y'all, again Jakar here with the extended book review for The Other Slavery. Again, it is by Andres Resendez. So reading this book, it took me longer than I wanted it to. I had actually started, I think, last summer, but I finished it, so here I am. Life happened. Um, so what I would say for this book is that, especially when we're Native American slavery is something that we're not taught in depth a lot through in K through 12, and then the only way you're going to learn more about it is if you're lucky enough to have a teacher who teaches the topic specifically in college. I was lucky enough to have a teacher when I was at Bellevue College who taught Pacific Northwest history, and we went fairly in depth about Native Americans. And then I also had a teacher in middle school who was pretty good. At least showed us like a little basic and went a little farther into the basics of Native Americans, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. So I've been pretty lucky to have an education that's given me more in-depth knowledge about Native Americans. But again, I recommend this for anybody who really wants to learn and really go into the weeds and details of what the other slavery was. So, like I said in the shorter video, as you're reading the book, it's referred to the other slavery because so obviously, if you know any general history about it, Cortez and the Spanish come and they conquer the Aztecs. And originally, the Native Americans or the indigenous people there, they think that they're these people who are good, but they're completely wrong. And a lot of the other, people who were around the Aztec, the other tribes of indigenous people, also worked with Cortez to try to take down the Aztecs. Anyway, as everybody knows, Cortez goes, tries to colonize all of them, take them as prisoners. They have more advanced, weapons for war. And then the Spanish keep working their way up north as they go along. So most people know that starting point, but the reason it's also called the other slavery is not only because Native American people and indigenous people have been enslaved for so long, but it's also because in the United States, when it was starting out finally becoming an actual country, or I guess because of the Constitution is what made it an actual country in 1789, while slavery of black people was going on since the late 1600s going up into the beginning of the United States. Um, the western side, so the west coast and the mountain regions of what is now the United States, Native American slavery had been going on for, I would want to say, probably 200 or 300 years, if not more. And the reason why we don't see that is because in on our an American history courses, especially when you're in K through 12, they're not going to teach you about what the Spanish were doing. The Spanish had already done their colonization process of Cortez defeating the Aztecs and then working up north, but they had many settlements, especially in the areas that are now New Mexico, and then also in other places that are now Mexico. So in that area, they had built a lot of settlements and they had taken Native Americans hostage and other indigenous people as they worked their way up. But again, because the United States didn't have this territory, it wasn't really a problem to them. And people who first landed on the East Coast and started their settlements, when you look at the stories of like John Smith and then people who came over later from Europe, they didn't go that far west. So it was all Spanish controlled, and they're the ones who were running everything. And that goes all the way back to the 1600s with the patriarchy in well, patriarchy mostly, but there was also a queen, but also basically the monarchy overall that was controlling Spain. But anyway, to kind of dive deeper into the book, as usual, I have taken notes on this. I take a more probably thorough notes than I need to, but it's always good to have things I think that people can look at, and like as you're reading it, you can see that are pointed out in the book. Like I said, for a book that was, I think, by the end of all of it, the total pages that you'll read for the actual book is about 314 pages. That's not including notes, acknowledgments, epilogue, and I don't think it includes the foreword. But for 315 pages, um, the author does a really good job of like trying to concisely teach you in detail and also keep it vague enough about a huge portion of history that people don't know that much about. So, like I said, I'd really recommend this book if you're looking for a more a jumping off point. Whether you're just getting into learning about Native American history or you have a decent knowledge of it already, this book will just add to the knowledge that you have. I would heavily recommend it. So, some things that kind of pointed that, I mean, I learned a ton from this book. There are things that it taught me more about exactly what Cortez was all about, and more specifically what he did, than the education I got when I was in school. I mean, there's a ton of things that I learned and some stuff that I relearned with more and new information. But let's see. I'm gonna look at some of the, and like I said, I try to keep these to about 15 or 20 minutes. But here are some more points that I took from the book. And like I said, take notes, put places in them, and look for them. Um, in a lot of the books that I read or that I get into, I try to learn about stuff that I don't know about already. A lot of times I like to go back to subjects that I have a decent wealth of knowledge about, but I also like to try to learn about new things. It just helps diversify the learning process. And a lot of stuff that I diversify my learning process about is around social justice and other injustices that have been done throughout history, and can really explain why things are the way they are today in our modern era and contemporary times. So, but and actually, the funny thing is, the way I got into this book was, I can give a shout out to her, Helen John, who also another. I already congratulated her, but congrats on graduating from Central Washington University. Also a poli sci major, so poli sci major strong. She actually bought this book as a present for her, and then I read the little summary or synopsis, and I was like, I bought this for her, so I was like, I want to get a copy for me because I want to read this. So that's actually how I got into this book. And again, thinking, okay, let me like read more about Native American history because there is so much to learn. One book is not going to give you all of it, so I'm sure I will be reading more stuff about Native American indigenous people in the future. But I was like, let's start here to get more knowledge, and also the knowledge I picked up from other friends who have been involved with Native Americans and indigenous people, or or they themselves are Native American or indigenous peoples from different parts of the world. So, start at page 156. Or actually, yeah, I'll start at page 156. And so in this part, if I find anything to read, one of the things that really did a great job with this book is talking about. It also cites many different Pueblo revolts that were going on in the mountain region, and that also sometimes went up into the Great Plains region of the United States, or what is now the United States. And so this happened with a lot of different Native American tribes or indigenous people of them revolting back. And sometimes they teach you about it in school, sometimes they don't. But I'm not gonna lie, when I'm reading it, sometimes I'm like definitely like cheering on the Native American and indigenous people because like when people are trying to come and like colonize you and take your land, that's obviously not great. So you have every right to fight back. And so he talks about the different Pueblo revolts, and a lot of these sometimes they're these like last stands, but really what you find out throughout the history, there's this continual battle between Native Americans. And the history is very complex, especially when you look at the Spanish, because it's like they're living among them, but then they try to enslave them, and then you have the Native Americans push back. It's actually really interesting because I think the reason why I highlighted this point is that with the Pueblo revolt, um, they were actually able to push back the Spanish, and the Spanish actually left quite a bit of the area that is over now. It's in New Mexico, the Santa Fe area, and within that vicinity, the Pueblos pushed them back. And the Spanish were gone for about 10 years and kind of retreated back to what is now Mexico. So that's what was really interesting to me. I was like, well, that's great to see because like they weren't gonna just let them come in and bully them. But eventually the Spanish do come back and try to regain all the ground that they had before. So let's see. Let's see. And as usual, a lot of these journal entries that the author pulls from, he's done extensive research, but a lot of them describe Native Americans as savages and how they're very ungodly, they're not clean, and they basically are just looked down upon as like basically I mean, they say they're in some regards they do say they're human, but they're really just saying that they're not too far off from just animals that we see in everyday life, and the way their interactions are, what they do with their daily lives and stuff like that, and about how they need to find Jesus Christ and God. Spain obviously was a big proponent of that. And so let's see. Go back here. I'm going to try to see if I can find the end of the passage that I can read to you all. Let's see. I'll read this short passage at the end of 162 going to 163. The Spaniard situation was becoming untenable, but they held out for a few more days. At last, on August 21st, reduced to the extremity of dying inside or going out to fight, the Spaniards made their move. A stream of 1,000 people flowed out of the Casas Reales, and strangled southward, fleeing for their lives. The adult males bearing arms numbered only about 100. They were posted at the front and rear and along the flanks of the crowd of women, children, servants, and animals. The armed men had to not only fend off Indian attacks from the outside, but also guard against escape attempts from the inside. The first day, the refugees walked merely 1 league, or about 3 miles. They spent the night in a broad field just outside town where they could easily spot any approaching warriors. The rebels were now in complete control of Santa Fe. Over the next few weeks of their journey, the Spaniards got their first look at the devastation in the wake of the insurrection. They passed through abandoned pueblos and past burned churches and ranches with strewn corpses as they moved southward, following the banks of the Rio Grande. The victorious rebels followed the retreating Spaniards, but left their way unimpeded. Within 2 months, the Spanish had abandoned the kingdom of New Mexico. It would not be back for 12 years. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 had succeeded. And actually, what's really interesting about this is when you read the book, this insurrection. That's how the author describes it, and I also think that how some of the journal entries that he found on this revolt specifically, how they describe it. They've been trying this for years, and they had been at it forever and ever and ever. And they're like, we need to do this, we need to do this. And it was a multitude of things of Native American tribes working together, and not, trying to work within each other's best interest, even though they might have complicated relationships between different tribes. They finally actually were able to overthrow the Spanish in Santa Fe, and so Santa Fe also, like you heard, New Mexico was the next, I guess, colonizing point for the Spanish as they were moving northward farther. The Spanish really took that range of New Mexico is it's either part of the Four Corner states of like Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, or it's next to them. I can't remember right off the top of my head right now, trying to picture the map in my mind. But either way, they were trying to take that whole spot over, and there's a large population of Native Americans and indigenous people. And throughout the book, he refers to them as Indians, and a lot of that has to do with the historical context of how people journaled about what Native Americans call them Indians, and everybody knows how that started because Christopher Columbus and all that stuff that happened in history in the past. So that was kind of cool, and I was like, okay, like they finally succeeded in 12 years. I mean, 12 years of them being able to take back what was theirs, and then the Spanish coming back again. But I don't think anybody's surprised by that, because the whole thing is about colonization, and all European powers. That's historically what they've been about. So why would the Spanish give up? They eventually came back and tried to take it over again. The other thing that was really interesting in the beginning of it, is actually what a lot of people don't know is King Philip IV and also Queen Mariana. So the monarchy of Spain actually had, it was interesting, King Philip IV started it with this anti-slaving campaign. So they did it in Spain, but then what they tried to do was they tried to spread the same message in the territories that they hold. Now, the thing that's hard about this is that a lot of European powers had territory that they were never directly going to be in or ever see, especially monarchs, because they would just be in Spain or England, whatever monarchy it was, they were just going to be there. But they tried to spread these policies because they believed that, enslaving Native Americans was wrong. Enslaving these indigenous people was wrong. It was always this thing that was bad. But it was really interesting to see, because, and I'm not trying to sit here and say that this is somebody's savior, that there's somebody's savior, but it was really interesting to see that they had this sentiment. So King Philip IV started it, then Queen Mariana did it, and then Charles II, which I believe was her son, if I'm not mistaken. This was earlier on in the book, but they really push hard for these anti-slave sentiments, and they keep pushing as they go along. Um, and so you find under King Philip IV that he's the one who kind of starts it off, and then Queen Mariana is really about it, and she's pushing it forward. She's like, we need to do it here in Spain. We need to do it in all the territories that we have. And so they try to do the same thing across the Atlantic. Now, as you're reading this book, you'll find out that is not how it went. It did not work well at all, and because everybody who was over in the New World, or what Spain thought was the New World, none of this was happening. So throughout the 16 and 1700s, they try to do this anti-slaving campaign. They have a lot of success in Spain because it's right there in their face and it's on the ground near them. It doesn't happen in the New World because eventually they kind of do it. There might be a little bit of a success, but with people who are worried about their own self-interest, their self-interest is to enslave people so that they'll work for them, and that's it. Why would you have any other interest? Because if you let these people go, you lose your labor, you're losing your livelihood, you're losing all the money that you have. And a lot of these people who had left from Spain were coming to start a new life and get rich quick, because there are so many resources that hadn't been tapped yet. And honestly, a lot of the Spaniards thought Native Americans were stupid because they had all this access to gold, silver, all these other mineral-rich resources, and they were like, why are you all building statues and stuff? Why are you all using it for this? You could be getting rich. When obviously Native American and indigenous people did not hold those mineral resources, and they didn't hold them in that view. They saw them as things that they would use to live and prosper in their societies, but it wasn't about getting rich or anything, because that just wasn't their way of life. Much more connected to nature, taking what they needed and living good and healthy lives. And obviously most of them, depending on what area you're in, different tribes are either hunter-gatherer, or they were hunter-gatherer and had permanent settlements, or a lot of tribes were nomads and they traveled based on the seasons where they could get the most food and where it was plentiful. So, but I'm going to see if I can find a passage in here. I'm kind of going longer. I'm going to try to keep it to 20 minutes. Let's see. Here we go. I'll read this part. The many orders and decrees that have come down to us illuminate Queen Mariana's and then King Charles' determination to protect the Indians. They speak of the gravity of the matter of Indian slavery and the scruples of conscience that their enslavement causes. Mariana often referred back to Philip's precedents, revealing a widow's desire to bring to fruition a project cut short by death. Something similar is true of Charles. In his most important decree, freeing all the slaves of the American continent, he devoted admiring words to his mother's efforts. Theirs was a family enterprise passed from one member to the next. Perhaps the great mystic of Agreda lurked behind their family's resolve. Philip became deeply impressed by Sor Maria's earnest injunctions to rule in Christian spirit by fighting oppression and providing justice, notions that extended so naturally to his indigenous subjects. So you can see, and I think I mistakenly said that King Philip IV was Queen Mariana's father. It was her husband who died, and then she continued on the legacy of that and then passed it on to Charles II. And so you can see that I just thought it was really interesting. Like I said, I'm not saying these people are saviors or by any means good, but you see that this sentiment of trying to get rid of slavery, abolish slavery altogether of Native American and indigenous people was a sentiment that they held at home in Spain, and then also wanted to pass to the Americas, where they had where they had colonized, and as they continued to move up into the New Mexico area, what is now New Mexico. So I just thought that was really interesting. And if you want to dive deeper into who they were personally, Queen Mariana, to me, based on what I read, was, her husband did some, and he was old, but she went real hard for the cause and tried to push it. Now, again, she wasn't successful in doing it in the Americas because there's no way you can regulate it, and you don't have everybody you can trust. And back then, getting documents and orders and decrees back and forth to how long to cross the Atlantic or to send to somebody. So I think the last thing I'll talk about too is what's really interesting is that one thing I read at the end. So Native American slavery, the Spaniards do it, and then it evolves into this whole other thing, because when the Spanish, they're kind of like trying to occupy the West, but then well, I'm not going to say most people, but many people learn in American history classes that they take when they're growing up. There's a Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson helps that whole transaction happen, and he gets all that land. Well, for a long time, the United States was slowly expanding westward, but they weren't doing it right away. So all those people who were out there enslaving Native Americans and indigenous people, they kept doing what they were doing from the beginning. It just was territory that belonged to somebody else, but the United States had really no knowledge of that territory yet. So you get things like Lewis and Clark to go all the way out to the West Coast to see what it's all about. But all this stuff is happening, and then even as territories start coming up, you see these Native Americans enslaved in different ways. Now, what's really interesting is that we see this happen to Black people on the East Coast and in the South, but Native Americans had actually, in that region of the West Coast, and then that mountain region going down into the New Mexico area and the other Four Corner states, they had actually figured out a peonage system, and basically servitude. So a lot of people here know indentured servitude when you think of when white people were first coming to England, coming from England to the Americas, and then some Black people came, and the whole plan originally it was indentured servitude. You come over, they pay for you to come over, and then you basically are a servant for a certain amount of time. Well, this had happened to Native Americans, but it's kind of mixed because they were forced into those positions, and they were also guaranteed things like protections from whether it was the government or other tribes. People kind of tricked them in, and then you also see in California it explodes, and California does some like real devious, just like slimy, grimy things with like putting laws in, and they actually like trick these Native Americans. So when you read the laws that they pass, they sound great on their face, but the content is still saying you basically can enslave these Native Americans. Like one of the things I read is in the 1850s or 1860s, Native Americans in California, they were like, slavery's bad, and so basically we're going to let them free. But if a Native American wasn't able to have a job or something, they said, oh, well, basically they'll be arrested for it. And then what we'll do is when they're arrested, people can come and bid on that Native American, and their punishment is basically it basically was indentured servitude all over again, which is ridiculous because like it's not fixing anything. You all are just changing your form of slavery. So what's actually really interesting is that the author talks about this and says when the South, when the United States on the East Coast and the South and the North what was going on with the Civil War, they actually found that basically, and I don't know if this was on purpose, but it seemed to be that they basically copied the same system of peonage. So when Black people were finally emancipated, and they weren't truly emancipated under the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, but they use the same system they use on the Native Americans. So it was actually used on them before, and then they saw an opportunity to do the same thing in the South. Now, again, like I said, I don't know if there's a direct link to whether there are people who are telling people in the South to do this, but they basically adopted a very similar situation. So you see after Emancipation Proclamation and then the Civil War, where troops march in on June 19th of 1865, and the last slaves in Texas are freed, this peonage system begins. So you see the same thing. Jim Crow pops up. That's basically an identical system of laws and rules that are set up in the South to enslave Black people again. Whether it's education, literacy test, whether or not you had a job, they're just different things that they put out. They're just like basic things that they penalize you for. You go to jail or you go to prison, and you become somebody's slave in a whole nother aspect. It's just that the system has changed. So this was actually used on Native Americans first, which I never knew and I thought was very interesting. And so this system on the West Coast and in the mountain range operated for a long time. They basically just moved from when the Spanish ended up leaving, the people who were there, who were working while the Spanish were there, they basically kept doing what they were doing and changed their systems. And actually, the United States actually tried to do different things to, because again, Native American slavery is forgotten about in a lot of aspects because what was going on in front of the United States in the 1850s and 1860s, and then when the Civil War starts, is black slavery, but they forget about Native Americans. And so then some people who are in Congress actually tried to write these into law to cover Native American slavery too. But as we know, a lot of those things that are written into law, they do some things going forward to change a little bit, but a lot of things stay the same, or the systems change to keep enslaving people. And so I just thought that was really interesting. And so I'm going to try to see if I can read a passage real quick, and then I'll leave y'all. Sorry, I'm kind of going long on this. But again, like I said, if you really need to read this book, there's so much detail, so much content. There's not a video I could do that's long enough to cover all this. But let's see. Let's see. And then also what's really interesting is that you see different tribes also getting split off because now that so many Spaniards had stayed in Mexico, the indigenous population had been intermixed. So Mexicans are really separating themselves away from the United States. And then, of course, the Mexican-American War had already happened. So you're seeing these Native Americans who are now left in what is the United States territory. They're just left out to dry. So Mexicans have their own their own country, and there's no connection now, as maybe there was more of a connection between the indigenous people who were in Mexico and the Native Americans who were on U.S. territory now. And so let's see where do I want to start? Let's see. I'll read this part. A Navajo headman named Armijo explained this phenomenon better than anyone during a visit to Santa Fe in January 1852. More than 200 of our children have been carried off, and we know not where they are. Armijo had told Indian agent John Greener, the Mexicans have lost but few children in comparison with what they have stolen from us. The Navajo men went on to explain how, for 5 years, this people had tried to get their children back to no avail. 11 times have we given up our captives, only once have they given us ours. Armijo said, my people are yet crying for the children they have lost. Is it American justice that we must give up everything and receive nothing? Indian parents had seen their children grow up in bondage in New Mexican homes. In many instances, they knew where their sons and daughters were being held, but were not permitted to get close to them after 3 decades of unrelenting slave taking. The Dene had had enough. This was the tinder for the 1860 Navajo attack on Fort Defiance and the campaign against the New Mexicans. So, there's a lot of stuff here that I'm not going to have time to unpack. But the other thing that you have to know is that there are also people who are intentionally stealing these Native American children to use them as slaves. And in in the area that is New Mexico, they are doing this on purpose. Now, what was really interesting is the United States actually did send an agent over to figure out what was going on, because when they tried to get reports back from that part of the country, well, now that part of the country, first of all, you don't have states yet; they're just territories. And so these people who are, running these territories, they're of course lying to Congress back in the United States, which is now the east, or what's the north, the south, and then starting to expand through what is now the Midwest. And they're basically lying to them about all the treatment of Native Americans that are going on. So there's just a lot to unpack. There are some Native Americans that actually work to capture other people in different tribes and then bring them so people could take advantage of them as slaves. So there is just a lot, but like I said, this book is great. It's really, really well done, super comprehensive, and I mean, I was really impressed about how you could fit all this history into 315 pages, make it he was able to make it make sense of it, and also you're able to follow along and touch on multitude of parts of Native American history and indigenous people's history that I never knew. And now that I have a better idea of and scope, so this is a book I would definitely recommend you all to read. I don't think people are taught about Native American history nearly enough, and it's a shame because, like the title says, it is really the story of the other slavery, because we focus so much on the slavery of Black people in this country, as we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we often forget about the Native American indigenous people who had suffered since, honestly, since the late 1500s all the way up into the I mean, honestly, all the way up to today. I can't really. I mean, if you're talking about the enslavement of them, it really lasts into, and certain forms of enslavement last up until the 20th century, and then you have another kind of form of when they're pushed onto reservations, and they're forced to assimilate from the cultures that they grew up in. So, like I said, please take, if you really want to learn about Native American and Indigenous people's history, please get this book, read it. It's worth the read. 315 pages, but it's worth it. I mean, it's history. You need to know it. It's more knowledge you'll have. All right. So thank you all for listening. Sorry it was kind of long. This is a very long. It's a long book, a lot of information. I hope you all enjoy. Um, I usually say this at the end, but if you're interested in more of my videos, you can like the video and you can also subscribe. I don't really care about that. I just do these because I enjoy doing them. But until the next review, y'all stay safe, stay healthy in times of COVID, and enjoy your reading at home.